I've heard it said on forums and in videos and articles that the 1980s was the worst decade for cars. Well, I disagree. I think the 1970s was the worst decade. Now, I lived through both decades, and I'm willing to make my case here. Now, I'm talking primarily about the US auto industry, who simultaneously suffered crushing emissions and safety regulations and two fuel crises at the same time. To understand what was going on in the 1970s, you need a little historical perspective. By this time, the World War II generation was in their 50s and 60s. They were at the height of their earning power. And they liked big, comfortable cars. And in America, big cars make money, small cars don't. The car companies were boxed in. They had to make big, profitable models with V8s that people wanted while meeting emissions regulations with carburetors, air pumps, low compression engines, and catalytic converters. Today, with computer-controlled engine management, it doesn't seem like that big a deal. But when car electronics were sketchy at best, you ended up with a Medusa's head of vacuum lines on top of a big V8 making only 150 horsepower. On top of that, foreign cars were making a big impact, especially among young buyers. So the American car companies had to milk the customers who had money now in order to finance new, smaller, and more advanced cars for the future. They had to make two completely different species of cars. The foreign car makers didn't. As a result of all this, almost every car was worse in 1978 or 79 than it was back in 1970. The 1970 Corvette's top motor cranked out 460 horsepower. In 1979, that spec had fallen to 225. Now, would you say the 1970 Mustang was a better car than the 78? Most sane people would. How about the Malibu? Mid-size performance in 1970, downsized and choked for 1979. Even foreign cars suffered under US regulations. Look at the 1970 MGB versus the 1979. You can now play this little game with all types of cars from 1970 to 1979, and you may even find a few that got better, but those are the exceptions. Now let's look at the 1980s. The decade started out a little rough as the big three took their first shaky steps towards modern cars. They still had temperamental carburetors with their flooding and hard start and vapor lock issues. But electronics was now catching up with car design. Let's play our little game again. The 1980 Mustang with its 139 horsepower V8 versus the 1989 5.0 with its 225. The Corvette went from mullet-powered poser in 1980 to ZR1 supercar by decade's end. Even family cars got better. In 1980, we had the Fairmont, and don't get me wrong, I like Fox bodies. But the 1989 Taurus was a better car for a family in every way. In 1980, we had the Chevette. In 1989, we had the much better Cavalier. 1980, the Pinto. 1989, the second generation Escort. Not only that, but Chrysler changed momming forever with the minivan. We had two generations of Mazda RX-7. Toyota brought mid-engine sports cars to the masses with the MR2. More and better small trucks hit the market. And the hot hatchback was making you want to take the long way to the grocery store. Turbocharging, fuel injection, and real performance were back on the market. Plus, at the close of the decade, the Mazda MX-5 was hitting the showrooms. The BMW 3 Series was at its height, and a new vehicle was on the drawing board as it was Ford's turn to change mom's car again. To sum it up, the 70s was a decade of descent. Cars almost uniformly got worse. When you traded in your car in the 70s, you couldn't be sure that you were trading up. In the 1980s, everything in the car world was looking up. It was a time of ascendance. You look forward to the next new car. You know, there's much more I could say, but I'm going to rest my case here. But let's no longer call the 80s the Malaise era. Maybe we should call it, I don't know, the mayonnaise era, because it adds spice. Of course, mayonnaise isn't spicy. I'm still working on that metaphor.